Hello, everyone. I'm Matthew Borey, Chief Intelligence Officer with Osprey Flight Solutions. I want to welcome you today to our webinar on the Yemeni Houthi activity in the region and the Red Sea conflict. We have participants joining as we speak. The numbers ticking up. I do want to give it a minute or so just to make sure we let as many as possible join to see the full presentation. This presentation is being recorded. It will be sent out after today's webinar is done as a follow-up. If you need to jump off, you will still get a chance to receive the recording and see anything that you missed, and also to be able to make sure that other relevant parties within your business can access the recording to get a data-led overview of the threat to air operations within Yemen, near Saudi Arabia, the Red Sea, Gulf of Aqaba, and other areas in the region. This is a key issue for Osprey. One of the pillars of how Osprey was founded was ensuring that not only were flight operations as safe and secure as they could be within the industry, but that information sharing is crucial, not just from governments to private sector entities, but from third-party organizations like Osprey as a leading threat intelligence provider to share this information that we've collected, the analysis that we've done with the rest of the industry to help serve as a sounding board for issues from operators to hopefully answer questions throughout today's webinar at the end of the session that you may have, and to give a baseline level of information and analysis to any operator or business entity or even government that is dealing with impacts from this ongoing situation in the Red Sea region. Right now, we're up over 170 participants for today's webinar that have joined. We did have close to 400 or more that signed up. Since I've been a part of Osprey, from day one, we've probably held 10 or so of these events, and this is by far the largest interest we've had. I think one of the reasons for that is due to the complex nature of this situation. It involves a number of airspace areas or flight information regions that are managed by different governments, from Israel to Egypt to Jordan to Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Eritrea, Djibouti, Yemen, and Somalia. So that adds a layer of complexity. The second part of the complexity is that the response to the Yemen Houthi attacks is a multinational task force designed to defend airspace from drone or missile attacks. They're also defending the maritime environment. Ships are actively being targeted, but air defense units and aircraft are shooting down ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones to keep not only airspace as safe as it can be, but to protect commercial vessels and other vessels as well in the maritime domain. However, the countries conducting the shootdowns are not the countries that manage the airspace. And a civil military deconfliction component to this is pretty unprecedented in the complexity that's going on. If you look at a situation like Israel, we had a webinar recently on that in the last couple months. Israel is managing its airspace and it's managing its air defense operations within that. There are external impacts on Israeli airspace and the surrounding airspace, but largely the air and air defense operations are being conducted by one main entity, and that's Israel. In this situation, drones and missiles have been shot down by the US, the UK, France, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Israel, and Jordan as well. And so information being shared with operators and between governments is being tested because of the complexity of the number of parties involved. And so hopefully today's presentation will go through some of those issues and allow for a more clear understanding of what has happened over the past 2 months, what the response currently is to try to mitigate the missile and drone launches by the Houthis at present in the short term, and then in the medium term, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months down the line, how does Osprey see this situation unfolding? So to start here, We'll take a look at the outline of today's presentation. We are going to summarize the last couple months as quickly as we can from an overarching perspective to see where this fits into the overall regional situation. We'll discuss some of the regulatory information that has been published. However, I do want to be clear, very little regulatory information has been published since the start of this activity. Most regulatory information that is present for the countries that are being affected by this in their flight information regions is either from prior to the start of this aspect of the conflict and related to Houthi activity from 2014, 2015 through 2022. And has not evolved since the situation here has developed, or there just isn't any for certain countries who haven't been affected in the past by the Houthi activity. So Egypt, Jordan, Sudan, Eritrea, Somalia, there's no NOTAMs for their FIRs related to the Houthi activity, and that'll be discussed on the regulatory information slide. Osprey has a wealth of data analytics on Houthi rebel activity dating back to mid-2018. So we do have a pretty sound understanding of what looks normal from a month-to-month basis on Houthi drone and missile launches and shoot downs of those by different forces, and what is abnormal. And we'll take a look at the last 5 years of data from Osprey to give a better picture of that. We'll discuss the capabilities of the Houthi drone and missile program, which is fully supported by Iran. We've pictured here on this slide the longest range, medium range ballistic missile that the Houthis have. They call it the Tufan. It's an Iranian Shahab 3 with a different name, and it has a range of 2,000 kilometers, which is well beyond the borders of Yemen and has been used to target Israel. Israel has been effective in shooting it down, but it shows just how complex this is. It is not isolated to just the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the Gulf of Aden, or the Southern Red Sea. This extends well beyond that, and that has been documented over the course of the last 2 months in a number of different instances. We'll look at the regional air and air defense posture. What I mean by this is how have the countries that are bordering the Red Sea responded with air and air defense activity, and what type of systems do they have at present? And then we'll also take a look, obviously, at the U.S., France, UK, and the Maritime Security Task Force capabilities from an air and air defense perspective. Once we go through all that, the last 4 sections of today's presentation are vital, in my opinion. Looking at indications and warning of further escalation beyond where we're at now, or indications of potential de-escalation, are what the analyst team at Osprey is mainly focused on. Identifying if there's going to be new areas that emerge from a risk perspective, or that current areas with elevated or acute risk at present from this activity, are there signs that's de-escalating? Because this is dynamic. The activity has evolved in several ways just over the last 2 months, and it's important for us to make that information available as soon as possible when the situation changes, so that operators can make better routing decisions, insurers can make better coverage decisions, and governments can give the best possible regulatory support as they can. Our medium-term outlooks are also important, not just looking at the next month to 3 months, but looking three months, 6 months, 9 months down the road to help give a forecast of where Osprey sees the trajectory of this conflict. And then lastly, we have 3 main takeaways that every operator, government, and insurer should keep in mind after today's presentation. During today's presentation, please do add questions into the question and answer section. At the end of the presentation itself, I'll do my best to answer as many questions as we can. If your question didn't get answered in today's presentation and you submitted it either during the presentation or after, a member of our team will reach out to you to ensure that you get a response to the query. And then lastly, please visit the Osprey website if you're not a client. We do have past information and analysis that we've provided on the Yemeni Houthis from 2017 through 2022 that is freely available for you to utilize to better understand how this group has conducted activity in the region in the past. And if you're an Osprey client, please access the Osprey system. We have forecasts, we have situation updates, we have airspace risk assessments for every one of the different areas we're going to be talking about today. And you can access those through the Osprey system. And if you do have any specific questions, a member of our CS team that is dedicated to your account would be happy to assist. Please feel free to reach out to your point of contact directly. All right, so we'll now get into what's gone on over the past several months. The impetus for the escalation in the Red Sea and in Yemen really starts with the Yemen and Saudi conflict that dates back to the 2014-2015 timeframe. That conflict involved the Houthis launching missiles and drones against airports, air bases, oil facilities, and other vital targets inside Saudi Arabia on a regular basis, especially from 21 into 2022. Many of those attacks were in the southwest provinces of the country, in Jazan, Najran, and Asir. However, the Houthis did target Mecca, Jeddah, Riyadh, Dammam, Dhahran, areas deep inside Saudi Arabia on over 80 occasions from that kind of 2018 to 2022 timeframe. At the end of the escalation in the 2022 timeframe, the Houthis were even launching ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones at the United Arab Emirates. Now, air defense systems, conventional surface air missile systems, such as the US-made Patriot, were employed with a high rate of effectiveness by Saudi Arabia during that timeframe to shoot down Houthi missiles and drones. Any ballistic missile that's being shot down is being shot down at high altitudes. The fact that Houthis were targeting airports means that civil aviation airways were being transited not only by missiles, but by the air defense response as well. Saudi Arabia, however, did conduct a pretty effective management of its airspace during this time to deconflict civil aviation from this military air defense activity as best as possible. Typically, when Houthi missiles or drones were launched, the Saudi air traffic control services, the ANSP, and civil aviation authorities sent aircraft to holding patterns, diverted aircraft to closest nearby airports when applicable, to deconflict the expected area of air defense engagements from where civilian aircraft were operating. This is a fundamentally different situation than we currently have now, because the Houthi missile and drone launches that are happening into the Gulf of Aden, towards Djibouti or Somalia, not necessarily targeting those countries, but in the direction of those areas into the maritime domain, that airspace is not controlled by Saudi Arabia in those cases. The type of activity that's also happening off the coast of Saudi Arabia in the southwest portions is touching into Eritrean airspace, is touching into Sudanese airspace as well. And so sending aircraft that are in separate FIRs, hypothetically, into holding patterns is not a possibility at present in many of the cases due to a lack of deconfliction between governments. So while Saudi Arabia has been effective in the past and would likely be effective going forward, if it were dealing with this in a frequent basis over its own airspace and FIR, the ability to do that in between FIRs has not really been seen at present, and really no mitigation is being done between several of the countries involved in the region to deconflict the military activity from civil aviation. One of the key points to remember is that after the Hamas attack on Israel on the 7th of October, the response from Iranian-backed groups has been to conduct attacks like the Houthis have to put pressure on Israel. Much of what the Houthis are claiming to have done over the past 2 months is to try to target Israeli and U.S. interests as a means to pressure the Israeli government to commit to a ceasefire in Gaza and end the fighting there. The Houthis have launched over 100 missiles and drones into the Gulf of Aden, the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, the southern Red Sea, and then northwards through the Red Sea towards the Gulf of Aqaba and the southern Israeli city of Eilat. The vast majority of these missiles and drones have been shot down. The primary targets of these are either vessels, military or commercial vessels in the southern Red Sea, Bab al-Mandeb, or Gulf of Aden, or fixed targets in Israel. Now, there have been no impacts in Israel. However, shoot downs that have happened by the Israeli Defense Forces, by the Egyptian Air Defense Forces, by the Saudi Air Defense Forces and Jordanian Air Defense Forces have led to debris splashdown that has occurred in the Gulf of Aqaba, in the southeast portion of the Sinai Peninsula, in southern Jordan, and in northern Saudi Arabia. And we'll talk through that as we get to the mapping section of today's presentation. Now, due to this type of activity, especially the attacks that have happened against the maritime domain, commercial vessels, and then now targeting military vessels, the U.S. announced the formation of a maritime security task force on the 19th of December. The task force was initially designed to solely defend ships from attack, so shoot down drones and missiles where appropriate, or to fend off any hijacking attempts. However, since the 11th of January, there has been an offensive kinetic component to the maritime security operation of Operation Prosperity Guardian. There's been over 175 U.S.-led airstrikes and cruise missile launches from the southern Red Sea, the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, and the Gulf of Aden into Yemen to target Houthi missile and drone program sites, the most recent of which occurred last night, overnight. Osprey clients will have received a full alert on this, so it should not be a new development for our users. However, this targeting of the Houthi sites in Yemen has led to the group continuing to state that it will conduct more attacks in response against Israel, against U.S. vessels, against UK vessels, as well as potentially look at hijacking attempts of other commercial vessels that the Houthis believe are affiliated with Israel in the maritime domain in the southern Red Sea, Bab al-Mandeb, and the Gulf of Aden. So governments have some information that's already in place from a regulatory perspective. What this looks like at present is every major external civil aviation governing body, the US, UK, Canada, Germany, France, and EASA, have advisories which effectively recommend, or in certain cases, national carriers for some countries are prohibited from accessing either all or the majority of Yemeni airspace. These are typically renewed on a yearly basis. This is fine for Yemeni airspace in Osprey's view to a certain extent. However, some of these advisories do not effectively cover the entirety of the Gulf of Aden where activity is happening at present, and that is a concern. You need to check your individual civil aviation governing body if the US, UK, Canada, Germany, France, or EASA apply to your operations to see what their recommendation covers, because they are slightly different when it comes to the overwater portions of Yemeni airspace. Remember, though, not all of these Houthi missiles and drones are being launched and shot down in Yemeni airspace. Some of them have been shot down since October in Saudi airspace, either over the southwest provinces, border areas, or over the Red Sea areas. And there are 3 entities, Germany, France, and Canada, that have advisories in place for Saudi Arabia. However, none of these have been updated since the new activity has started. They relate to the Houthi activity that was going on from 2014-15 through 2022. and do not fully take into account where activity is happening in the overwater portions of Jeddah and the Red Sea, as well as the northern portions of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf of Aqaba. We have had 2 regulators that have issued advisories. They're only advisories. They're not prohibitions. They're very limited in detail. The UK and EASA both did in the November-December timeframe, telling operators to use caution and to conduct risk assessments effectively over the Gulf of Aqaba area within 150 nautical miles or 200 nautical miles or so from a designated geographic point. This does raise to operators that they need to look at the area, but there are no real mitigation measures that are provided, and no specifics on the type of activity that it's occurring, the altitudes that it's occurring at, and the deconfliction or lack thereof that's happening between governments related to it. And the bottom line is there's very limited information being publicly shared by the countries impacted by this. Again, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Eritrea, Somalia, Sudan, Egypt, Jordan have issued little to no information to operators about what activity is happening within their respective flight information regions. There's very little information that shows these governments are working together to deconflict aircraft from military operations effectively throughout the entirety of the Gulf of Aqaba, Red Sea, Bab el-Mandeb, and Gulf of Aden. And lastly, while Israel has a NOTAM in place for its entire airspace that says there's conflict activity taking place, and that is a positive, and there are strong measures in place within Israeli airspace for civil military deconfliction that are being implemented. When Israel shoots down drones or ballistic missiles or cruise missiles that are being launched towards Eilat, those shoot downs are happening in the airspaces of other countries, Egypt, potentially Jordanian airspace or Saudi airspace over the Gulf of Aqaba, and it is unclear at present what level of civil military deconfliction is happening between those 4 governments related to this specific issue. And one of the cruxes of the problem is that the Gaza conflict has made the diplomatic situation between Israel and its neighbors complex. So the complexity of the diplomatic situation is having a negative impact on the civil military deconfliction related to airspace defense against Houthi attacks on Israel that the Houthis claim are in response to the Gaza conflict. So again, if this were a situation where it was one government dealing with its own airspace and issuing its own NOTAMs and conducting its own civil military deconfliction, the transparency would likely be greater in detail. The overarching Israel-Gaza conflict, coupled with the fact that we're dealing with 5 to 6 flight information regions and shoot downs by 6 to 7 different military forces, makes this something that operators need to watch very closely for every flight that they conduct in this region. All right, so what we're going to do next is take a look at data analytics. I know I've highlighted how difficult this situation is and how important this situation is from Osprey's point of view. The reason why Osprey is alerting on this activity so often, why we're holding this webinar today, is the data analytics, which you can see on the screen that date back to 2018, show that this is the most intense level of Houthi missile and drone activity that we've ever seen in a 60-day period. And the shoot down activity that we've seen has covered the widest geographic area that we've ever seen and included the largest number of different military forces shooting down Houthi drones or missiles. Again, when we saw activity in 2021 and 2022 that you can see is elevated and persisted for about an 18-month period in heightened intensity, this was the vast majority of which, outside of just a handful of events in the UAE, this was Saudi Arabia in Saudi Arabian airspace dealing with Houthi missiles and drones. Right now, we have essentially twice the amount of activity in a 60-day period than we've ever seen in any other 60-day period. that's affecting 6 different flight information regions and has 6 to 7 different entities involved in air and air defense operations. So not only is the geographic complexity and the airspace complexity different than what we've seen in the past, the frequency of the activity that's occurring is the highest we've ever seen from the use of missiles and drones by the Houthis, both ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, and the amount of air defense activity or air-to-air shoot downs in response. The other problem here is that the Houthis have a history of targeting airports and flying drones in particular along civilian flight paths to try to target those airports without being detected. It increases the likelihood of misidentification related to the Yemen conflict. And the Yemen conflict, as we've talked about already and we'll look at in detail in the coming maps, expands well beyond the coastal areas of Yemen or the Yemeni land borders. Okay, so the next slide is going to look at the Gulf of Aqaba and the Northern Red Sea. At least 8 occasions in the last 10 weeks, the Houthis have attempted to launch ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, or drones at Israel. Many of these are being shot down before they reach the Northern Red Sea or Gulf of Aqaba, but we have seen approximately 15 to 20 being shot down by Israel, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and potentially Jordan in the Gulf of Aqaba, over southern Jordan, or over northern Saudi Arabia. So the top of the map covered by the turquoise shape is effectively southern Israeli territory near Eilat. The drones and missiles are transiting up the Red Sea, and then in the Gulf of Aqaba area, they are effectively in the northern Red Sea. They're effectively either being shot down or they're failing in flight and impacting either in the water of the northern Red Sea or in the water of the Gulf of Aqaba. However, again, in Tabuk, which is effectively right in the center point of the green shape at the top, there have been reports of shoot downs there and debris splashdown in northern Saudi Arabia. And again, in southern Jordan, cruise missile debris splashdown either from shoot downs or missile failures as well. So if you think about frequency, we're talking about 15 or so, 20 or so missiles on a total of about 8 to 10 events over the course of 10 weeks. This is a weekly issue. The area in green is effectively where the air and air defense activity is happening to shoot down the threat. The area in white is where these missiles and drones are transiting. One of the questions that we did have is, what are the altitudes that this is happening at? Missile and drone activity is different, and even within missile activity, there's differences. Houthi cruise missiles are flying typically between surface and flight level 200, and the shoot downs are happening typically between surface and flight level 200. However, if a Houthi cruise missile fails in flight, it can fly an unplanned trajectory and can affect altitudes much higher than flight level 200, though it would be unguided at that point, and the issue would be a hazard and not a threat. There would be no direct intent to shoot anything down, but you would have an uncontrolled missile flying until it splashed down on land. Again, Houthi drone activity is going to be similar to Houthi cruise missile activity. It's going to be up to about flight level 200 in most cases. And so for cruise missiles and drones, the transit and the shoot down is typically happening below the altitudes at which civilian aircraft are flying. However, again, Houthi missiles and drones do fail in flight, and when they fail, they don't always crash down right away. They will fly an unplanned trajectory and profile that needs to be considered. When it comes to ballistic missiles, and I need to stress this because reporting that has been provided to the industry, both by governments and by other providers, has indicated that ballistic missiles are a low altitude issue. While yes, the impact of a ballistic missile when it hits the ground will be the point on the ground that it hits. When the missile is in its final stages of flight, after re-entering typically from low Earth orbit of space and coming down, it is flying through all altitude levels. When it is being shot down by the Israelis, for example, with an Arrow conventional SAM system, like has happened several times during this conflict, it is happening at high altitudes. When Patriot missiles are being used by Saudi Arabia, for example, potentially currently and in the past, to shoot down Houthi ballistic missiles, this activity is happening at all altitudes. It is not a 20,000 foot flight level 160 type issue. The use of high altitude conventional SAMs to shoot down ballistic missiles is an all altitude threat, and the potential for misidentification emanates from this concern. Now, Houthi ballistic missile activity is less often than cruise missile activity or drone activity as it pertains to this environment in the Gulf of Aqaba and the Northern Red Sea. However, it is not a low altitude issue, and it needs to be assessed based on the high altitude aspect and the long range aspect of the surface to air missiles being utilized to shoot down the ballistic missiles. Yes, this is transiting through airways used by civilian aircraft. I've used this example on previous webinars, and I want to highlight it again. We're talking about the same kind of ballistic missile technology that North Korea launches into the Sea of Japan, and no operators are flying in North Korean airspace over the Sea of Japan because of last year, maybe 20 ballistic missile test launches into the Sea of Japan. These missile systems are, for all intents and purposes, for what we're evaluating, no different. So it poses a hazard when ballistic missiles are launched at all altitudes. It poses a threat when high altitude conventional SAM systems are used to shoot down those weapons. So the key point being here, the white areas are the transit areas. The white areas is where there's a hazard. The green areas, missiles are transiting, drones are transiting, but there's also air and or air defense happening to shoot those down. And that, again, for drones and cruise missiles up to flight level 200 in general. For ballistic missiles, I want to stress again, high altitude conventional SAM systems used to shoot down ballistic missiles is an all altitude threat, and misidentification potential emanates from that. All right, so now we're going to take a look at the Southern Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. The neon green outlines are the different flight information regions. I apologize for not mentioning that in the previous slide. What that highlights here, though, is the number of FIRs that are affected by this. So to the north, you have Egyptian airspace and Sudanese airspace affected, Saudi airspace, Sudanese airspace, Eritrean airspace, Djiboutian airspace, which is technically part of the Addis Ababa but again, another complexity here. And then lastly, Somali airspace as well, right on the borderline. So again, using the same kind of coloring, the areas in turquoise for the part covering Yemen effectively shows where missile launches can be happening from, and then where shoot down activity has been reported. In general, we do have the individual geographical points if you'd like to go through that. But again, this is a complex situation. Over water shoot downs are not like over land shoot downs. When a missile gets shot down over land, you have people that see it. They take videos of it. They talk about the city that it was near. When a missile gets shot down over the middle of the Gulf of Aden or the middle of the Bab el-Mandeb or the Southern Red Sea, and no government is really providing defined exact points on that from an aviation perspective, it is hard from an open source intelligence point of view to pinpoint the exact locations of where that's happening, which is why we're showing the general areas where this activity is occurring. Now, I think some people will be surprised to see, the green area at the top of this map being north of Jeddah, where we're saying air defense shootdowns happen. The first set of Houthi drone and missile attacks that were launched towards Israel were the USS Carney shot down 19 drones and 4 cruise missiles happened north of Jeddah over the Red Sea. That's been confirmed by satellite imagery of where the USS Carney was located on that date in late October, and it's been highlighted that also on that date the USS Carney and the U.S. Navy was not the only entity that shot down Houthi drones that day or missiles. Saudi Arabia also conducted air defense operations. However, Saudi Arabia has yet to publicly comment on any air and air defense activity that has occurred over its airspace related to this situation. Most of the Houthi activity that had been happening in the late October to late December timeframe had been happening in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait in the southern Red Sea area, both within Yemeni airspace, but also Eritrean airspace and parts of Saudi airspace. However, what we've seen in literally the last 2 weeks, and especially the last few days, is Houthis conducting missile and drone attacks in the Gulf of Aden. One of the reasons why Osprey assesses this is occurring is that an Iranian spy ship that was in the Red Sea that was providing targeting support based on publicly available information provided by news media outlets, that ship, the Bershad, has moved into the Gulf of Aden and is now providing Houthi targeting and intelligence support from the Gulf of Aden. So again, this is not an issue that's going to be localized to one individual area. It's already affecting the Gulf of Aden, the Bab el-Mandeb, the southern Red Sea, including Saudi airspace in the Red Sea north of Jeddah, and then the Gulf of Aqaba region as well, as was discussed on the previous slide. The first 3 weeks or so of the conflict as well, Israel was being targeted, as in Eilat was being targeted more frequently than the maritime vessel activity in the southern Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. But again, that shifted. So we saw a shift from the north to the south, and then we've seen a shift from partially the southern Red Sea into the Gulf of Aden. The key here is that this is not going to remain static. The Houthis are going to adapt their targeting. The United States and the UK are going to have to adapt their air defense posture. And I also want to highlight, these air defenses are not perfect. 3 vessels in the last 3 days have been hit by missiles or drones, and no air defense attempts were made to shoot those down, because deconfliction is difficult, detection and engagement is difficult. Today in Eilat, an Israeli air defense missile interceptor was launched at a false target. The sensitivity levels of air defense forces is high right now to defend against this. Mistakes can't happen. The engagement of a false target in Israel is not the first time it's happened. It's happened twice in Eilat now since late November, including today. It's happened over 10 times in Israeli airspace, especially in the north on the Lebanese border in the last several months. And it's likely happened in the southern Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandeb, and the Gulf of Aden. It just hasn't been publicly reported by military forces. So that's the other point that I need to highlight. Not all of the threat intelligence information is publicly available. Osprey puts an exceeding amount of effort to identify as much publicly available information as we can to make as accurate an assessment as possible. But specific information on exactly when and where and the altitudes that this is happening at is in the hands of governments. And I would advise operators, insurers, or governments even to talk to each other about this, to make sure that the picture that everyone's operating off is clear. All right, so some of the things we're going to talk about next are the capabilities of the Houthis. So just to start off, we highlighted on that first slide of today's introduction that the Tufan or the Iranian Shahab 3 has a 2,000 kilometer range. From Houthi-controlled territory, it can essentially target almost all of Israel. It could target anywhere in Saudi Arabia or the Gulf. The same for the Quds 3 cruise missile. We've seen both the Tufan and the Quds 3 being used in launches against Israel during this conflict. And then lastly, the Shahed 136 drone, the most capable in the Houthi arsenal, is capable out to flight to 2,500 kilometers, though unlike ballistic missiles that are going into low Earth orbit and transiting all altitudes, again, this is going to be operating primarily below flight level 200. The same would go for the Quds 3, though it can target sites well into the Eastern Mediterranean Sea with a 2,500 kilometer range. The images that are on these slides, these are not from random areas. These are from Houthi parades where they've shown off their arsenal. If you're an Osprey client, in both October of 2022 and October of 2023, you will have received a full brief of both parades that the Houthis conducted with all of the weapon systems that they displayed, identified, and will help in your risk identification process as you do the risk analysis component to follow on within your risk assessment and risk management applications. From a ballistic missile perspective, again, there are different types of ballistic missiles that the Houthis have. They have the shorter range series that are being used in the Red Sea, in the southern portion, in the Bab el-Mandeb, in the Gulf of Aden. They can use the longer range ballistic missiles, however, they'd like to target things up in the Gulf of Aqaba as they have. When it comes to weaponized drones, again, we're looking at shorter range systems from the Qasef 2 with a 300 kilometer or so range, again, reserved for probably those attacks we're seeing in the southern Red Sea, Bab el-Mandeb, and the Gulf of Aden, though the Samad 3 and the Wadid 2 or the Shahed 136, the alternate name, those are being used for those longer range attacks towards the Gulf of Aqaba. This is just a visual representation of what I've highlighted. The Houthis can attack targets across the region with the arsenal of weapons that they have. And again, cruise missiles, drones, up to flight level 200 for operating. In general, ballistic missiles are going all altitudes on the way up and all altitudes on the way down. Now, what has the regional response been? The U.S. military has, announced that they've deployed high altitude terminal high altitude air defense systems, or THAAD, and Patriot SAM systems to supplement what they've already got deployed in the region. Jordan and Saudi Arabia both have those systems deployed within their borders from the United States to help defend those airspaces. These systems are capable up to flight level 820, again, all altitudes, and out to ranges of about 160 kilometers. These THAAD systems and Patriot systems are the type of weapons that are used to shoot down ballistic missiles at high altitude. U.S., U.K., and French Navy vessels that are deployed in Saudi airspace off the Red Sea coast, as well as in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and in the Gulf of Aden, are going to have various conventional SAM system capabilities. SM-2 systems on the U.S. assets are going to be very similar to a Patriot. And then you have the Sea Viper missiles for the UK and the Aster 15 and 30 missiles for France that are going to be capable up to about flight level 450 and out to about 30 kilometers or so. So again, high altitude systems that can be used to shoot down a variety of targets. And then as we think about this, we also have the individual countries. Saudi, Jordan, Egypt, all do have U.S.-made Patriot systems deployed within their borders. Saudi Arabia has a number of these in the southwest provinces, and then to defend their main urban centers, Riyadh, Jeddah, Tabuk, Yanbu, for example, Taif. And then Egypt is going to have these with Sinai coverage. Jordan's going to use theirs to defend Amman, and supplementing that with the U.S. Based assets as well. Again, both Jordan and Saudi Arabia have U.S. THAAD Patriot type systems deployed within their borders to supplement their air defense. Egypt does not. It uses its own air defenses, though much of that has been procured from the United States. Israel has a variety of systems. They do have U.S.-made Patriots. They also have their Arrow systems, their David Sling systems. Again, these are high-altitude systems capable at long ranges and designed to shoot down combat aircraft, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles. They also have Iron Dome systems that can shoot down drones, cruise missiles, rockets, and then a variety of other systems. So the air defense system capabilities is not the issue to defend against the Houthi attacks. The issue is how are all of these countries and military forces integrating these military operations within several different airspaces against threats ranging from low altitude, low flying drones to higher altitude cruise missiles to all altitude ballistic missiles. It's a complex job, and civil military deconfliction is paramount when it comes to this. So what are we watching? And I think that's one of the key points now to run through the last 5 to 10 minutes here before we do questions. We're watching to see what the intensity level of the U.S. strikes are. At present, the strikes are an indication of escalation, though there haven't been very many casualties caused. They're conducting them at night. They're conducting them against military-related targets. They're not conducting strikes against heavily civilian-populated areas. They're not targeting Houthi leadership. They're very focused on Houthi missile and drone program targets. They're not taking out Houthi ground force centers of gravity. So trying to degrade the abilities of the Houthis to make advances on the ground in Yemen along the front lines. These are not the type of strikes the U.S.-led coalition is conducting. The strikes so far have been targeted and focused on Houthi drone and missile program targets. While it is an escalation, how it evolves is very important to the trajectory of this conflict. So keeping track of how often the strikes are happening and what kind of targets they're hitting is what Osprey is watching for when it comes to escalation. Now, Saudi Arabia has not been involved in these strikes in Yemen. Osprey's view is that since the Houthis have not been directly targeting Saudi Arabia at present with these strikes or ballistic missile or drone or cruise missile launches, that their involvement is not required, and they're continuing to try to negotiate a long-term peace deal with the Houthis in the midst of this entire situation, while also trying to reestablish diplomatic ties with Iran, who backs the Houthis. So if you want to, from Osprey's point of view, an escalation indicator that hasn't been triggered yet is Saudi-led coalition airstrikes. If those start, that is a key trigger for Osprey. Now, the Houthis have been targeting a regional maritime and oil interests. When we say oil interests, we are still mainly talking about oil tankers in the maritime domain. It is an indicator of escalation. The specific countries of registry or ownership or both for these attacks are what Osprey is looking at closely now to define escalation. Two of the vessels that have been damaged in the last 3 days were U.S.-owned vessels. So the Houthis trying to target U.S.-type owned vessels. The other vessel that was hit recently by the Houthis in the Gulf of Aden, or excuse me, that was nearly hit by the Houthis in the Gulf of Aden in the last week. It was a Russian owned vessel, but it was previously owned by a UK company. Osprey's digging into the maritime ownership status and registration status to see if the Houthi targeting matrix is expanding from mainly US, UK, Israeli link to a wider set, because it's already an escalation, but how deep is that escalation going to be? Are they going to have limits of what they're willing to target or not? We already are seeing the Houthi attacks on Israel and the US, and then Saudi Arabia and Saudi coalition members. Prior to the start of the conflict in Gaza in late September in Saudi Arabia, the Houthis did conduct drone attacks into southwest Saudi Arabia that killed Bahraini soldiers. So this indicator had already been tripped prior to the Gaza event, the Gaza conflict starting and the Hamas attacks into Israel. So we were already monitoring for escalation in southwest Saudi Arabia prior to this starting. The Houthi suspension of UN-led talks would be an indicator that has not been tripped. but we'd be watching for very closely if it were. And then Iranian drone and missile shipments, there had been no indications of this until literally just a couple of days ago. United States military announced that it had interdicted a shipment of cruise missile and ballistic missile components in the Gulf of Aden. So that's another piece of escalation. It indicates the Iranians are still trying to resupply the Houthis with missiles and drones. The Houthis can't produce this equipment on their own. They need it supplied by Iran. So interdictions of those shipments by the U.S. and other coalition members indicate that Iran is continuing to try to supply the Houthis, which highlights there's no indication of de-escalation when it comes to the resupply. And then increased Iranian malign activities in the region with an emphasis on Saudi Arabia. We're watching for this very closely. Just the fact that the Houthis are doing this type of activity sponsored by Iran, and it's happening in the Red Sea, is malign activities supported by Iran that are affecting Saudi Arabia. So how deep is this going to go? Is it just going to be in the Red Sea? Is it only going to be smaller scale drone attacks in Southwest Saudi Arabia on the border posts? Or are we going to see Houthi activity expand deeper into Saudi Arabia again? We're monitoring very closely for that. It would be a sign of escalation. There are some potentials for de-escalation. As I discussed, the Saudis and the Houthis are continuing to negotiate on a longer-term peace deal. If that does come to fruition, it could help de-escalate the situation. A de-escalation in the Gaza conflict or a ceasefire in Gaza would likely de-escalate this. And then Houthi changes in their negotiation stance with the Yemeni government itself. So you have the Houthis in control of a large portion of territory in Yemen. You have other federated entities that form the Yemeni government in control of others. They're negotiating their own internal peace deal in Yemen. The Houthis have some demands there. And depending on how that plays out also is important to the current situation at present. And if the Houthis were to change some of those demands, it could indicate de-escalation. Lastly, on a positive note, both the Houthis and Saudi Arabia continue peace talks, and Iran and Saudi Arabia are continuing on with the reestablishment of their diplomatic ties. Yesterday, the Iranian and Saudi foreign ministers had a call. Obviously, the full details of that are not public, but that dialogue has not been shut down. So we're monitoring that closely. Within the next 3 to 9 months, Osprey does assess it's possible that a new ceasefire is reached between the Saudis-led coalition and the Houthis, but this is not likely to happen until after a ceasefire in Gaza of some form is reached. I know it's a separate conflict, but the likelihood that we're going to get a full domino effect of several conflicts in the region being solved prior to the Gaza conflict being at least de-escalated and hopefully towards a ceasefire from a humanitarian and security perspective. The impact of that on the rest of the region is kind of hanging over all of this. We think it's a realistic possibility that with no ceasefire between the Saudi-led coalition and the Houthis, and if the Gaza conflict continues to persist, which Osprey expects it to over the next 3 months and longer, that we'll see further Houthi missile and drone attacks in the Red Sea region. The majority of this, so stuff happening on a every day or every couple day basis in the southern Red Sea, Bab el-Mandeb, and Gulf of Aden is expected. However, based on the frequency, so 10 attempts in about 10 weeks to, about 10 attempts since late October to target Israel, we expect multiple times a month or monthly to see the Houthis attempt longer range attacks towards Israel involving ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and/or drones and associated air and air defense shoot downs. And then the most dangerous scenario here is that no ceasefire is reached. And not only do we have this Red Sea conflict at present in the overwater areas, but that Saudi Arabia restarts strikes into Yemen, and then the Houthis restart with the drone and missile activity into Saudi Arabia and potentially the Gulf region. And we're back to where we were in 2022, but with the Gulf of Aden, Bab el-Mandeb, and Red Sea and Gulf of Aqaba being affected, on top of Southwest Saudi Arabia, the interior of Saudi Arabia, and parts of the Gulf region. We think this is unlikely, but it is the most dangerous outcome, adding or re-adding a conflict that had dissipated into a currently present conflict that's already complex enough. So the key three takeaways that I want to highlight: this Houthi activity is happening mainly, again, the majority of it is happening in the southern Red Sea, Bab el-Mandeb, and Gulf of Aden. There are ATS routes that are over or near some of these areas that are being used by civil operators. Osprey's advice is to avoid overflight of the southern Red Sea, Bab el-Mandeb, and most of the Gulf of Aden, subject to an operation-specific risk assessment. And then for flights over the Gulf of Aqaba, conducting a risk assessment prior with automated threat intelligence, and maintaining altitudes above flight level 260 with increased fuel for diversions, and pre-planned diverts is the key for minimizing your exposure to a catastrophic event if you're flying over parts of the Sinai or the Gulf of Aqaba. Again, we don't think that any of these military forces, US, UK, France, Israel, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi, are intending to target civil aviation. The Houthis have a history of targeting civil aviation, as in airports, with ballistic missiles and drones, and that when air defense operations are happening, including with conventional SAM systems at high altitude, it creates the possibility of misidentification, and that is a possibility over each of the areas that Osprey's discussed today. I would reference the maps that we talked about earlier that show transit areas versus air defense areas, and I would minimize operations in the areas where shoot down activity is taking place. When it comes to the transit areas, again, minimize time spent in there, but utilize those same mitigations that were discussed for the Gulf of Aqaba previously. Lastly, when it comes to the southern Red Sea, Bab el-Mandeb, and the Gulf of Aden, this is where we expect miscalculation or misidentification to be most likely, and at all altitudes. On a positive note, most of this area is covered by the Yemeni airspace prohibitions and restrictions from the US, UK, Germany, France, EASA, but not all of it. And so being able to risk assess your flights that are in Saudi Arabia, any part of its airspace, including over the Red Sea, Eritrea, Djibouti, Somalia, is paramount. So if you don't have a way to risk assess the airspace outside of Yemen itself, Osprey can assist you with that. Whether you're a client or a prospect, please reach out if you're finding challenges in conducting the risk management process around a very difficult environment. Okay, so we're coming up to time here. I have tried to answer most of the questions that were put into the Q&A as I've gone through the presentation. But I am going to take a look. One of the questions that we have is it, in Osprey's opinion, is it safer to fly from Dubai to Central Europe via Iran or Iraq, or via Saudi Arabia and Egypt crossing the Red Sea? The simple answer to that is we think it's safer to fly through Saudi Arabia and Egypt. If you look at where the activity that's happening is over the Gulf of Aqaba and the northern Red Sea, there are ways to avoid the areas that are having air and air defense activity taking place, or to spend minimal time in the areas where air and air defense activity is taking place. Overflying Iran right now, with the current situation that's taken place there in the last few days, related to ballistic missile launches into Pakistan, Iraq, and Syria, as well as its history of shooting down a civilian airliner in 2020, and in the decade prior to that, having prior misidentification events that nearly shot down airliners, and the current situation in Iraq with the ballistic missile launches into Iraq by Iran, and the use of ballistic missiles inside of Iraqi airspace near the main airways that are present there by Iranian-backed militant groups. Osprey's current assessment is that those two airspace risk areas, the Western Iranian north-south corridor and the Eastern Iraqi north-south corridor, are extreme risk for Iraq and high risk, nearly extreme risk for Iran, whereas only a portion of the northwestmost portion of Saudi Arabian airspace over the Red Sea and the southeasternmost portion of the Sinai are high risk, but you can fly around those high risk areas. So the short answer is Saudi and Red Sea near the Sinai would be Osprey's advice solely based off our our top level risk ratings versus Iran and Iraq. We could probably have an entire webinar on the Iran and Iraq situations. I do understand how complex the entire region is at present, but that is one thing to keep in mind. We do have another question about the time of day that these are happening. Now, most of this activity happens in hours of darkness historically, dating back to 2018 from Osprey's data. So flight operations during the day is the main mitigation advice for most of this, especially the activity that's happened towards Eilat, the northern Red Sea. However, that is a bit different now if you're talking about Yemen proper and in the southern Red Sea, Bab al-Mandeb, and the Gulf of Aden. We are seeing daytime events there. Again, that's why we have two separate risk areas, one for the southern Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden and the Bab al-Mandeb, and another one for the northern Red Sea and Gulf of Aqaba, because there's different type of activity happening at different times in different ways. Okay, so there is a question on the recent air intercepts north of Jeddah. Again, I did cover that. The first attacks by the Houthis that happened towards Eilat, where the USS Carney shot down 19 drones and 4 cruise missiles, and the Saudis shot down several drones and cruise missiles, but have not officially announced it, happened north of Jeddah in the Red Sea. Again, we can share the satellite imagery of the USS Carney in the northern Red Sea on the day of the shootdowns, if that's required. But then obviously all the Israeli air and air defense activity that shot down missiles and drones in the Gulf of Aqaba is happening north of Jeddah as well. All right, so again, I've hit the time. We have a number of questions that have come in. There's over 17 questions. This is the largest number of questions. We will look to reach out to you each with answers that weren't provided during today's session. If you have any questions related to your current subscription with Osprey or how to maximize that, please reach out to your dedicated customer success point of contact. If you're a client, if you're not an Osprey client, please go to info@ospreyfs.com to reach out, or go to our website and fill out our contact form. Or if you're working through discussions at present with one of our sales executives, please reach out to them directly. We'll be more than happy to assist you navigate this complex crisis. Thanks very much for the time today. We are a few minutes over. I understand everyone has a busy schedule. We do value your time as clients and the wider industry as a whole. And again, if there's any support that Osprey can provide, please do reach out and we'll support that promptly. And finally, again, the recording to today's webinar will be emailed out in a follow-up, and you'll be able to see anything you've missed and share with additional members of your team to make sure a baseline level of information has been provided to all that need it. Take care.